Why, Qiming? It's just business, Lin Shen. I will take it all back.
The applause was loud enough to drown out the ambulance sirens outside. The world's largest technology summit had reserved its final keynote for me. Every screen displayed my face beside the logo of Orion Dynamics, the robotics empire I had spent 18 years building from an abandoned warehouse into the company that supplied autonomous systems to half the planet. Yet while thousands stood to celebrate me, the board of directors had already voted to erase my name. I only learned that because my security badge stopped working. The glass doors to the executive floor refused to open. A young security guard, someone I had never met, avoided my eyes. "I'm sorry, Chairman Lin." "Chairman." Past tense. He swallowed. "They told us not to let you inside." For a moment, I simply stared at the red light blinking on the scanner. Then my phone vibrated. Emergency board resolution. I opened the document. My voting rights had disappeared overnight. My shares had been diluted through a series of financing agreements that required unanimous approval, agreements carrying my own digital signature. A signature I had never given. Someone had planned this for years. Someone sitting at my own conference table. Another message arrived. "Don't make a scene. The media is already downstairs." No name. It didn't need one. Only 3 people knew I always read anonymous messages first. One of them was my closest partner, the man who used to tell reporters that Orion existed because I had believed in impossible machines before anyone else did. Su Qiming, my oldest friend. I entered the building through the underground laboratory instead. Engineers looked up from prototype drones before pretending they hadn't seen me. Fear spread faster than gossip. Everyone already knew. No one wanted to stand beside the man who had just lost everything. The elevator opened directly into the boardroom. The conversation inside stopped. 12 directors, 3 lawyers, 2 government observers, and Su Qiming sitting comfortably in the chair where I had spent the last decade making decisions that changed industries. He smiled, not warmly, not cruelly, simply like a man greeting someone who no longer mattered. "You're here. I built this company. You did." He folded his hands. "And now it's time for someone else to lead it." I looked around the room. No one met my eyes. Not Director Zhao, whom I had defended after his disastrous overseas acquisition. Not Madame Shun, whose research division I had kept alive despite years of losses. Not Chun Rue, who once admitted Orion had saved his family's manufacturing business. Years of loyalty had evaporated in silence. I laughed quietly. "You forged my authorization." Su didn't deny it. Instead, he leaned back. "The documents are legal. They're fake. They've already been recognized." One lawyer slid a folder across the polished table. Every page carried my signature. Perfect. Impossible to distinguish from the real one. The government's observers remained expressionless. Procedure mattered more than truth. One director finally spoke. "We need stability." Another nodded. "The market won't tolerate uncertainty." Interesting. No one mentioned justice. Only stock prices. Only confidence. Only the next quarterly report. I realized something then. Companies rarely collapse because strangers attack them. Most fall because trusted people quietly rearrange the foundation while everyone is looking at the skyline. Su stood. "I've arranged a generous retirement package." "I don't want your money." "I know." "Then why offer it?" "Because refusing it makes you look emotional." His voice stayed calm. "Accepting it makes you look wise." There it was. Not hatred. Calculation. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He was managing risk. "Even now, you always had one weakness," Su continued. "You believed people loved innovation." "They do." "No." He shook his head. "They love certainty." He walked toward the massive window overlooking the city. "You spent billions building technologies 10 years ahead of the market. And now those technologies lead the market." "They do now." He smiled. "But investors don't reward pioneers. They reward whoever arrives just before everyone else." For years, I had dismissed his cynicism. Now I was sitting in my chair, wearing my title, owning my company. "You've been preparing this." "For 6 years." The answer came without hesitation. I knew eventually Orion would become too valuable to belong to one visionary. You mean too valuable to belong to me? I mean companies outgrow founders. Silence settled across the room. I searched every face. No surprise. No guilt. Only exhaustion. As if my removal had simply been another difficult agenda item. The board secretary pushed a final document toward me. If you sign this, the transition will remain confidential. I didn't touch the pen. What happens if I don't? Sue answered. Then tomorrow, every financial paper publishes stories about reckless spending, unstable leadership, and hidden safety risks. They're lies. They'll investigate. He shrugged. Investigations create headlines. Headlines move markets. Again, not truth. Only consequences. I left without signing. Outside, reporters had already gathered behind barriers. Microphones pointed toward the entrance like weapons. Someone shouted my name. Another asked whether Orion's latest humanoid project had failed. A third wanted confirmation that the founder had suffered a mental breakdown. Amazing. The story had already been written. It only needed my face. I ignored every question. Inside my car, my hands remained steady on the steering wheel. That frightened me more than anger would have. I wasn't shocked anymore. Only tired. The city lights blurred through the windshield. Every intersection reminded me of another decision. The apartment where I coded our first navigation algorithm. The cafe where Sue and I promised neither of us would ever sell our principles. The warehouse where 6 engineers worked beside, leaking pipes, because we couldn't afford proper offices. I had remembered every sacrifice. Perhaps I was the only one. The rain began without warning. Traffic slowed. My phone rang. It was Professor Hahn, my university mentor, one of the few people who had never asked me for favors. I heard. So quickly. You built the biggest robotics company in Asia. He sighed. Nothing involving you stays secret. I failed. No. His voice remained gentle. You confused trust with permanence. Neither of us spoke. Finally, he asked quietly, "What will you do now?" I looked toward Orion Tower, rising above the skyline. My name had been removed from the digital display. Workers were already installing a new logo. I don't know. You once told me machines are easier than people. I was right. He laughed sadly. No, I wasn't. You underestimated machines. I frowned. They only become dangerous after people teach them what they value. The call ended. His words lingered. Machines reflected their creators. Companies did too. My apartment felt strangely empty. Awards lined the walls. International patents. Innovation medals. Photographs with presidents and scientists. None of them could unlock a boardroom door. I poured tea that had already gone cold. My laptop automatically connected to Orion's internal network. Then the connection disappeared. Access revoked. Research removed. Files gone. 18 years compressed into a single error message. Permission denied. I stared at those words for a long time. Not because of what they meant, because of how ordinary they looked. The end of a lifetime didn't arrive with dramatic music. Sometimes it arrived as plain black text on a white screen. Far across the city, a news broadcast began. Breaking news. The anchor smiled professionally. Orion Dynamics today announced a historic leadership transition. I muted the television. The silence felt heavier. On the coffee table lay an old photograph. 5 young engineers. Cheap instant noodles. Second-hand computers. Impossible dreams. Sue stood beside me with one arm over my shoulder. On the back, he'd written in black marker, "We'll build tomorrow together." I closed my eyes. For the first time in years, I wondered whether tomorrow had ever belonged to us at all. The apartment was silent except for the rain tapping against the windows. I should have been furious. Instead, I kept staring at the old photograph. 5 young men. One impossible dream. Back then, success had seemed simple. Build better machines. Solve harder problems. The rest would follow. Somewhere along the way, I had forgotten that companies weren't built only on technology. They were built on incentives. And incentives changed people long before money ever did. My phone buzzed again. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Then I answered. Lin Shunt. The voice belonged to Lu Wan, the head of Orion's Advanced Robotics Laboratory. He sounded terrified. They're deleting everything. I stood immediately. What do you mean? The new management ordered every experimental project reviewed. And they're shutting down the adaptive cognition platform. My heart sank. They don't understand it. I tried explaining. What did Sue say? Lou hesitated. He said there won't be enough profit for at least 8 years. 8 years. I had spent nearly a decade building that architecture. Not because it would make immediate money, because I knew where robotics would eventually go. They're selling several patents as well. Lou continued. To who? I don't know. His breathing grew uneven. I thought, you deserve to know. Before I could respond, another voice shouted in the background. Lou! The call disconnected. I looked at the blank screen. He had risked his career simply by warning me. Perhaps loyalty hadn't disappeared completely. Perhaps it had only become expensive. I drove toward Orion's research campus. Security blocked the entrance before I even reached the gate. The guard recognized me. His expression was painful. I'm sorry. I know. They gave us new access lists. I know. He lowered his voice. Several researchers resigned tonight. How many? I only heard rumors. Why? They said the company stopped building the future. He looked over his shoulder to make sure no one was listening. They said it started chasing quarterly reports instead. For a brief second, warmth returned to my chest. Ideas survived longer than positions. I nodded. Take care of them. I can't. No. I corrected myself. You can. He frowned. People remember who treats them with respect. The guard said nothing, but he stood a little straighter. I parked across the street. From there I could see the lights inside Laboratory 7. The place where we had built our first autonomous manufacturing arm. The place where half my adult life had disappeared. One by one, the lights turned off. Darkness spread through the building. I suddenly realized something. The laboratory wasn't dying because I had left. It was dying because the people now leading it couldn't see beyond next year's earnings. Technology had always demanded patience. Greed demanded speed. The two rarely coexisted for long. A familiar voice interrupted my thoughts. You look terrible. I turned. Professor Hahn stood under an umbrella. I thought you'd still be at the conference. So did everyone else. He handed me a paper cup of hot coffee. I figured you hadn't eaten. I accepted it without argument. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. We simply watched engineers leaving the campus. Most carried cardboard boxes. One young researcher stopped halfway across the street. She looked back at the building, then quietly wiped her eyes before walking away. Professor Hahn noticed it too. They're losing more than employees. They're losing belief. He nodded. The dangerous thing about vision is that people only recognize it after it's gone. He smiled faintly. You still remember my lectures. I ignore half of them, and the other half, they kept me alive. Come with me, Professor Hahn said. We walked to the university where I had studied almost 20 years earlier. Most classrooms were dark. The engineering building remained brightly lit. Students were still working. Some argued over circuit boards. Others tested robotic arms assembled from inexpensive aluminum frames. Their equipment looked primitive compared to Orion's. Yet the excitement in their voices reminded me of another time. My own time. Professor Hahn stopped outside an old laboratory. You remember this room? I laughed softly. The ceiling leaked whenever it rained. It still does. He unlocked the door. Inside, almost nothing had changed. Old benches, worn tools, dusty oscilloscopes. A faded whiteboard still carried equations from some forgotten lecture. This, my voice caught, is where we built our first navigation prototype. Professor Hahn nodded. You were 18. I thought one good algorithm could change the world. You were right. I shook my head. No, it changed the company. It didn't change people. He looked directly at me. Did you ever ask it to? He placed a small storage drive on the workbench. What's this? A backup. I frowned. I thought Orion owned everything. They own the corporate servers. He pushed the drive closer. I own my research. I stared at him. There are early versions of your adaptive learning architecture. My student notes? And mine. They're obsolete. No. He smiled. They're unfinished. For the first time that day, my heartbeat quickened. The architecture on that drive wasn't enough to rebuild Orion. Not even close. but it contained the original philosophy, a system designed to let machines learn efficiently without consuming impossible amounts of computing power. The very idea investors had mocked. The same idea that eventually made Orion famous. Only now, it still belonged to me. I can't ask you to fight for the company, Professor Han said quietly. I've already lost it. No. He shook his head. You lost ownership. He tapped the storage drive. You haven't lost your ability. The distinction struck harder than I expected. Ownership could be taken. Skill could not. Memory could not. Experience certainly could not. My phone vibrated again. This time a message came from Sue. Accept the retirement agreement before markets open. Don't make this difficult. I read it twice, then locked the screen. Professor Han watched my expression. I nodded. What will you do? For years, that question would have had only one answer. Fight. Sue. Expose. Retaliate. Tonight. None of those felt right. If I dragged Orion into public war, thousands of employees would suffer before the executives did. Factories would freeze. Research would stop. Families would pay the price. Sue understood that. He expected me to protect the company again, even after it no longer belonged to me. I slowly placed the phone on the table. I won't rescue them. Professor Han didn't speak. They made their choice. Still silence. If they destroy what we built, I looked through the laboratory window toward the sleeping campus. They'll have to watch it collapse with their own hands. The word surprised even me. Not because they were cruel, because they were calm. For the first time since the betrayal, I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about freedom. Professor Han walked toward an old robotics workbench covered by gray cloth. He pulled away. Beneath it sat a compact industrial robotic arm, scratched and outdated. The university was going to throw it away. It barely works. It works enough. He smiled. Every empire starts with something people underestimate. I ran my fingers across the cold metal. Old motors, old controllers, old hardware. But possibilities didn't depend on appearance. They depended on imagination. For years, I had commanded billion-dollar laboratories. Standing in that forgotten room, touching an obsolete machine, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time. Curiosity, pure, uncomplicated, untouched by shareholders or quarterly reports. Outside, thunder rolled across the night sky. I slipped the storage drive into my pocket. The future that had been stolen from me suddenly seemed smaller than the future I could still build. I wasn't ready to forgive. I wasn't ready to forget. But I was finally ready to stop clinging to what was already gone. A quiet thought settled in my mind. If Orion had become too large to remember why it existed, then perhaps the next revolution shouldn't begin in a skyscraper. Perhaps it should begin in a place the world would never bother to notice. A forgotten workshop, an old robot, a handful of believers, exactly where impossible things had always begun. Then everything went black. A sharp pain exploded through my chest. The coffee cup shattered against the floor. Professor Han lunged toward me. Lin, the laboratory lights blurred into streaks. The last thing I heard was the frantic echo of his voice. The last thing I saw was the old robotic arm standing silently in the darkness. And then, nothing. Lin, a distant voice echoed through the darkness. It sounded familiar. Too familiar. Lin Shun, are you planning to sleep through Professor Han's lecture again? Something struck my shoulder. Not hard, just enough to jolt me awake. I opened my eyes. Sunlight poured through dusty classroom windows. The smell of chalk replaced the scent of hospital disinfectant I had expected. Rows of old wooden desks stretched before me. Students laughed quietly. Someone behind me tossed another rolled-up notebook onto my desk. What happened to you? My roommate whispered. You look like you died. I froze. The classroom, the cracked ceiling fan, the faded green chalkboard. Professor Han, 30 years younger, stood at the podium writing equations with his left hand exactly as he always had. Impossible. My breathing slowed. I looked down at my hands. No wrinkles. No scars from factory accidents. No wedding ring that I had worn for years before quietly taking it off after work consumed every relationship in my life. Young. Strong. 18. The date displayed on the classroom projector confirmed it. September. My first semester. The day Orion had not yet existed. The day I still believed talent alone could build the future. A chill ran down my spine. The final moments before darkness flooded back into my memory. The boardroom. Sue's calm smile. The forged signatures. The laboratory. The pain in my chest. Then, nothing. I wasn't dreaming. Every detail felt too precise. Even the scratch on the edge of my desk, where I had carved a tiny circuit symbol during orientation week. I slowly closed my eyes. This wasn't another chance because I deserved one. It was another chance because life had asked a question. Would I build the same future? Or would I finally understand why the first one failed? Professor Han turned around. Lin Shun. The entire classroom looked toward me. In your opinion, what limits artificial intelligence? The younger version of him looked exactly as I remembered. Patient, curious, never embarrassed a student simply for being wrong. In my previous life, I had answered with an hour-long explanation about processing power. Today, I answered differently. Human incentives. The room became quiet. Professor Han lowered the chalk. Explain. I stood. Technology follows the goals of the people funding it. If investors only reward short-term profit, then even brilliant technology becomes ordinary. Several students exchanged confused glances. One laughed softly. Professor Han didn't. He simply watched me. And if the incentives change, then innovation changes with them. He remained silent for several seconds. Finally, a small smile appeared. Interesting. He wrote one sentence beneath the equations already covering the board. Technology reflects values before it reflects intelligence. I remembered hearing him say something similar many years later. But not today. Not in this classroom. Had I changed the conversation already? The lecture ended. Students flooded into the hallway. My roommate, Zhao Kai, wrapped an arm around my shoulder. You've become philosophical overnight. I've been thinking. Dangerous habit. He laughed. Forget thinking. The robotics club is interviewing new members. You promised you'd come. The robotics club. Memory flashed through my mind. A cramped basement workshop. Broken equipment. Almost no funding. I had attended only twice before leaving to chase freelance programming jobs. I needed money back then. Every hour mattered. Because I left, I never met several engineers who later became pioneers in autonomous hardware. Instead, Sue introduced me to another network, another path, another future. I looked toward the engineering building visible through the campus trees. A single decision, one I had considered insignificant. Perhaps it wasn't. I'll go. Zhao blinked. Really? Really? He grinned. I knew skipping class would improve your personality. I smiled despite myself. Some things, thankfully, never changed. Campus looked smaller than I remembered. Not because it had changed, because I had. Buildings that once seemed enormous now felt almost intimate. Students hurried between lectures carrying cheap laptops and stacks of photocopied textbooks. No one knew the future. No one knew which ideas would become industries. No one looked twice at the old engineering annex sitting behind the main laboratory. Most students avoided it. The roof leaked whenever it rained. The elevators rarely worked. Equipment came from companies that no longer wanted it. I walked directly toward it. The basement workshop smelled of machine oil and hot metal. Old lathes lined one wall. Half disassembled robotic arms occupied another. A handwritten sign hung crookedly above the entrance. Innovation Club Workshop. Someone had crossed out innovation. Below it, another student had written, Repair Club. Laughter echoed inside. A young woman wearing protective goggles looked up from a circuit board. We're closed. I'm here for interviews. She removed the goggles. You actually came? I said I would. No. She smiled. I mean anyone. She pointed around the room. This place isn't exactly popular. I recognized her immediately. Chen Yue. In my previous life, she had become one of China's leading experts in robotic precision actuators. We had met only once at an international conference almost 15 years later. She hadn't remembered my name. Today, she was simply another college student trying to keep an almost forgotten workshop alive. I'm Lin Shun. Yue. She offered her grease-covered hand without embarrassment. I shook it. Firm grip, confident eyes. Exactly the kind of engineer investors often underestimated. Behind her stood 3 other students arguing over a broken robotic arm. It isn't the motor, it's the controller. No, the gearbox is slipping. They noticed me. One of them sighed. Another programmer? Probably. They all think software fixes everything. I almost laughed. In my previous life, I would have agreed. Now I knew better. Software without reliable hardware was merely theory. Hardware without adaptive software was merely machinery. The future belonged to those who understood both. I walked toward the workbench. May I? The students exchanged uncertain looks. Finally, one stepped aside. The robotic arm was old. Very old. Manufactured nearly 20 years before my previous life ended. One glance revealed the actual problem. Not the gearbox. Not the motor. The power regulation board. A tiny capacitor had swollen from repeated voltage spikes. I reached for a screwdriver. Yue raised an eyebrow. You've done this before? Something like that. 5 minutes later, the arm rotated smoothly. Silence filled the workshop. One student bent down to inspect the board. How did you notice that? It wasn't random. I pointed toward the wiring. The failure pattern repeats every few hundred cycles. They stared. I realized my mistake. No first-year student should notice something like that so quickly. I cleared my throat. Lucky guess. No one looked convinced. Yue folded her arms. I've never seen you here before. First day. You planning to stay? For a moment, images from my previous life returned. Glass headquarters, luxury offices, endless meetings, then this small basement. Old machines, limited tools, students with impossible dreams. Strangely, I felt more hopeful here than I had inside a billion-dollar boardroom. Yes, she smiled. Good. We need people who enjoy fixing impossible problems. I looked around the workshop. The cracked windows, the patched electrical cables, the forgotten equipment. No one outside this room would imagine history beginning here. Neither had I. Not the first time. This time, I intended to prove them wrong. The workshop emptied slowly as evening settled over campus. Most students packed their bags without looking back. They had assignments, part-time jobs, entrance exams, and lives waiting outside the engineering building. Only 4 people remained. Chun Yue carefully wiped grease from the robotic arm we had repaired. Zhao Kai leaned against the wall, eating instant noodles straight from the cup. 2 other club members argued over whether they could salvage a burned motor controller. I quietly watched them. In my previous life, boardrooms have been filled with experts carrying impressive titles. This room held students with stained sleeves and second-hand tools. Yet I recognized something the boardrooms had lost years ago. Curiosity. No quarterly report could manufacture it. No investor could buy it. Yue placed a stack of notebooks in front of me. You fixed our oldest robot. Now earn your membership. I opened the first notebook. Hand-drawn designs. Gear calculations. Control algorithms. Most of them were rough. Several were fundamentally flawed. None of them were lazy. Someone had spent hundreds of hours trying to solve problems with almost no resources. That effort deserved respect. Which project matters most? I asked. The room suddenly became quiet. Yue looked toward the corner. Covered by a faded canvas sheet stood something nearly 2 meters tall. She walked over and pulled the cloth away. A humanoid frame. Incomplete. No outer shell. No hands. Only an exposed skeleton of aluminum and steel. We call it Pioneer. It doesn't work, one student admitted. We've been trying for almost 2 years. No funding. No proper sensors. No processors powerful enough. So everyone says it's impossible. I slowly circle the frame. Impossible? No. Just early. Very, very early. I had spent 18 years watching the robotics industry evolve. I knew exactly which technologies would mature, which manufacturing methods would become affordable, which design philosophies would quietly disappear. Standing before Pioneer felt strangely emotional. It reminded me of Orion before success had buried simplicity beneath endless ambition. What would you change? UA asked. Everyone looked at me. I resisted the urge to answer immediately. The old me would have listed 20 improvements. The older me knew something different. People support ideas they help build, not ideas handed to them. What do you think is its biggest weakness? I asked instead. The discussion began instantly. The joints. No, battery efficiency. Control latency. The balancing system. For almost 30 minutes they debated. I listened, occasionally asking another question, never interrupting. By the end, something interesting had happened. They had identified nearly every major design flaw themselves. UA finally looked at me. You already knew all of that. I suspected. So why didn't you just tell us? I smiled. Because you'd remember your own conclusions longer than mine. She stared for a second before quietly nodding. Professor Han says something similar. He gives good advice. As the others returned to work, my phone vibrated inside my pocket. An unfamiliar number. I answered cautiously. Mr. Lin, a professional female voice. I'm calling from FutureSoft Solutions regarding your internship application. I remembered immediately. My first life. I had accepted their offer. Spent months writing enterprise software completely unrelated to robotics. The salary had felt enormous. Enough to pay tuition. Enough to help my parents. Enough to slowly pull me away from the workshop. That decision had changed everything. We'd like to schedule your interview. I looked around the room. Old machines. Determined students. Impossible dreams. The future quietly waiting inside forgotten places. When, this Friday, in my previous life, I had accepted before she finished speaking. Today, I'm withdrawing my application. A brief silence. I'm sorry, I won't be attending. May I ask why? I looked at Pioneer. Because I'm already working on something more important. She thanked me politely before ending the call. The room seemed strangely brighter afterward. Not because anything had changed, because I had. That evening I returned to my small apartment near campus. It looked exactly as I remembered. Second-hand furniture. A slow desktop computer. Books stacked against the wall because I couldn't afford shelves. I turned on the computer. The startup sound echoed through the room. Painfully slow. I smiled. The machine that once frustrated me now felt almost nostalgic. I opened a blank document. Instead of writing code, I began writing predictions. Not lottery numbers. Not stock prices. Knowledge. Technologies that would appear over the next decade. Manufacturing breakthroughs. Battery chemistry. Sensor miniaturization. Neural network optimizations, government policies encouraging automation, supply chain changes, companies that would rise, companies that would disappear after refusing to innovate. I wasn't trying to recreate the future exactly. That would be impossible. Changing even one decision had already begun altering events. Instead, I wanted principles, directions, opportunities. The future wasn't a script. It was a landscape. Knowing the mountains mattered more than memorizing every path. Near midnight, someone knocked on my door. 3 slow knocks. I opened it. Professor Han stood outside, carrying 2 paper bags. I suspected you skipped dinner. You were right. He handed me 1 bag. Steamed buns. Still warm. I heard you joined the robotics club. News travels quickly. It leaks through old professors. He smiled. We sat at the tiny kitchen table. After several minutes, he noticed the growing stack of handwritten notes beside my computer. You've been busy. I'm organizing ideas. He glanced at 1 page. His eyebrows rose slightly. These manufacturing estimates. I immediately reached over and turned the page. Just speculation. He didn't press further. Instead, he asked quietly, "Do you know why I stayed at this university? You could have worked anywhere. I was offered much better laboratories. So why stay?" He looked through the window toward the engineering buildings. Because the world's greatest inventions rarely begin in places already convinced they're important. His words settled deeply inside me. The previous timeline flashed across my mind. Orion had eventually built magnificent research centers, but its first breakthrough had happened in a rented warehouse with leaking pipes. Maybe greatness truly preferred humble beginnings. Professor Han finished his tea and stood. Before leaving, he paused at the doorway. One more thing. Yes, the university plans to close the basement workshop next semester. I looked up sharply. What? Budget cuts. They say maintaining the equipment isn't worth the expense. When was this decided? Recently. In my previous life, I had never even known, because I had already left. Yue and the others must have fought alone, lost alone, watched the workshop disappear alone. I slowly clenched my hand, not from anger, from realization. Some futures weren't inevitable. Some only happened because no one stayed long enough to stop them. Professor Han studied my expression. I thought you should know. Then he quietly left. I stood in the silent apartment long after the door closed. Outside, the campus lights reflected against the window. The workshop had given countless students a place to build impossible ideas. If it disappeared, so would the people who needed it most. I looked back at the list of future technologies on my desk, then toward the engineering building beyond the darkness. I finally understood my first mission. I wasn't going to build another empire. Not yet. First, I had to save the tiny workshop where that empire could be born. The next morning, I arrived at the workshop before anyone else. The corridor lights were still dim, and the building echoed with the hum of old ventilation fans. A thin layer of dust covered the workbenches, proof that no one from the administration had entered for quite some time. I unlocked the door with the spare key Yue had given me the previous evening. The familiar smell of machine oil greeted me. For a long moment, I simply stood there. In my previous life, every laboratory I managed had spotless floors, million-dollar equipment, and teams of specialists. Investors toured them regularly, praising our innovation while asking how soon it could become profitable. This room had none of that, yet somehow it felt more alive. I rolled a whiteboard into the center of the workshop and wrote a single sentence across the top. Why should this workshop exist? When the others arrived, they stopped in the doorway. Zhao Kai squinted at the board. That's a strange way to start the morning. Yue placed her backpack on a chair. You're asking the wrong question. Am I? The administration already thinks it shouldn't exist. Exactly. I uncapped a marker. If we can't answer this question better than they can, they'll shut us down. Silence settled over the room. No one argued, because everyone knew it was true. One student finally spoke. We build robots. I shook my head. So do hundreds of universities. Another answered. We compete in engineering competitions. So do thousands. A third crosses arms. We help students gain experience. That's valuable. But is it unique? The discussion stalled, not because they lacked intelligence, because they had never been forced to define their purpose. In my previous life, Orion nearly collapsed for the same reason. We had become excellent at building products. We had slowly forgotten why we built them. Yue stared at the whiteboard for several minutes before quietly saying, We solve problems that no one else wants. Everyone turned toward her. She continued, Companies chase profitable projects. Universities chase published papers. We fix broken machines. We experiment with discarded parts. We take ideas everyone else has already given up on. I smiled. There it is. She frowned. What? Our purpose. I wrote her words across the whiteboard. We build what others ignore. The atmosphere in the room changed almost immediately. Not dramatically. Subtly. People straightened in their chairs. Someone nodded. Another student looked toward the unfinished humanoid frame in the corner with renewed determination. Purpose had a strange effect on people. It made difficult work feel meaningful. That afternoon, the club advisor arrived unexpectedly. Professor Liang, a practical man in his 50s who cared deeply about students, but trusted numbers more than dreams. He looked around the workshop. So, I hear morale has improved. Yue smiled. We have a plan. I hope it includes funding. He pulled a folder from his briefcase. The dean has scheduled a review. My expression remained calm. When? Next week. He sighed. If the committee decides this workshop isn't producing meaningful results. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. After Professor Liang left, Zhao Kai dropped into a chair. How are we supposed to impress them? They'll expect expensive prototypes. We don't even have enough money to replace half our sensors. Everyone looked at me. I understood why. In only 2 days, I had repaired equipment they couldn't fix, asked questions that changed how they thought. But I wasn't here to become their hero. I was here to build a team that could stand without me. We won't compete with money. I picked up an old servo motor. We'll compete with ideas. The following hours became the beginning of something unexpected. Instead of assigning tasks, I divided everyone into pairs. One group focused on mechanical reliability. Another redesigned power management. Yue and I analyzed Pioneer itself. Every improvement had one rule. No expensive components. Everything had to be built using discarded equipment or locally available materials. At first, several members complained. This would be easier if we could just buy new hardware. It would, but then we'd only be proving we can spend money. I looked around the room. I'd rather prove we can think. No one argued after that. You've done this before. I smiled faintly. You keep saying that. No. She shook her head. I mean leading people. I've watched how you work. You never rush to fix things yourself. You keep asking questions until someone else finds the answer. I looked down at the wiring harness in my hands. In my previous life, I hadn't always worked that way. When Orion grew, I tried solving every important problem personally. It made the company dependent on me. When I disappeared, so did many of its decisions. That had been one of my greatest mistakes. I learned it the hard way, I said quietly. She tilted her head. You talk like you're 40. I laughed. Some days I feel older. She laughed too. Neither of us noticed that the tension filling the workshop for the past 2 days had quietly disappeared. As night fell, Pioneer finally stood under its own power. The movements were awkward, slow. The balancing algorithm still needed work. But for the first time, the robot took 3 steady steps across the concrete floor. No one spoke. Then Zhao Kai shouted. It walked. The room exploded into cheers. Someone clapped. Another student actually jumped into the air. Yue covered her mouth, trying unsuccessfully to hide her smile. I watched the robot carefully. 3 steps. That was all. In my previous life, Orion's machines crossed disaster zones, assembled spacecraft, and performed delicate surgery. Yet somehow, those 3 uneven steps felt just as important. Every giant leap began with movements that looked insignificant. The celebration ended when the workshop door opened again. A man in an expensive suit stepped inside. He looked completely out of place among the grease, tools, and scattered machine parts. Professor Liang stood behind him. His expression was uneasy. Everyone, this is Mr. Su Ming. He represents Horizon Technologies. The name caught my attention immediately. Horizon, one of the fastest-growing robotics companies in the country. In my previous life, they had become famous for buying university research at extremely low prices. Mr. Su smiled politely. We've heard your workshop is struggling. I may have a proposal. His eyes slowly swept across the room before stopping on Pioneer. Then, he smiled a little wider. The kind of smile I'd seen countless times in boardrooms. A smile that measured value before speaking. Without realizing it, he had just reminded me of another smile. Su Qiming's. Different face. Same calculation. I'd seen where that road ended. This time, I intended to recognize it before it was too late. The workshop fell silent. Mr. Su didn't seem bothered by the grease on the floor or the worn-out machines. If anything, he looked amused. His polished shoes contrasted sharply with the cracked concrete beneath them. He clasped his hands behind his back and slowly walked around Pioneer. He lightly tapped one of its aluminum support beams with a finger. Not bad. The compliment sounded rehearsed, especially considering. His eyes drifted around the room. Your circumstances. No one answered. Yue stood beside the robot, unconsciously placing herself between him and the machine. He noticed. A faint smile crossed his face. You must be Chun Yue. She frowned. You know me. We know everyone who wins provincial robotics competitions. He reached into his briefcase and placed a glossy folder on the workbench. Horizon Technologies has a university partnership program. Professor Liang folded his arms. They're offering sponsorship. The room instantly became more attentive. Sponsorship meant new equipment, better computers, proper testing instruments. For students surviving on tiny budgets, it sounded like a miracle. Mr. Su opened the folder. We'll renovate this workshop. Replace every outdated machine. Provide internship opportunities. Several students exchanged excited looks. Then he added one final sentence. In return, his finger tapped the contract. All intellectual property developed here will belong exclusively to Horizon Technologies. The excitement disappeared. I remained silent. In my previous life, I had negotiated hundreds of licensing agreements. This one looked generous. It wasn't. It was designed by someone who understood that desperate people often accepted the first lifeline they saw. Yue spoke first. So anything we invent would belong to your company? Mr. Su nodded pleasantly. You'll still receive recognition. Recognition, not ownership, not control. Recognition was inexpensive. Patents were not. One student whispered, maybe that's still worth it. Another quietly nodded. I understood why. Most of them had never imagined creating something valuable enough to matter. Mr. Su wasn't buying inventions. He was buying possibility, at the lowest possible price. He turned toward me. You haven't said anything. I'm listening. And I smiled politely. You've prepared an excellent offer. His expression brightened. Then I continued. For Horizon. The smile faded just enough for me to notice. You disagree? I think we're discussing different investments. He raised an eyebrow. Explain. You see old equipment. I see a team learning to solve difficult problems. You value the patents they'll eventually create. I value the people capable of creating them. A quiet silence spread across the workshop. Mr. Su studied me carefully. You speak confidently for a first-year student. I've had good teachers. Professor Liang coughed softly, hiding what looked suspiciously like a smile. Mr. Su closed the folder. What if this workshop closes? No one answered. He looked around the room. Without funding, that's exactly what will happen. The words landed heavily. Because they were true, he wasn't threatening us. He was describing reality. Then he looked directly at me. So, do you have a better solution? Every face turned toward me. I could have lied. Could have claimed I already had investors. A secret plan. Unlimited confidence. Instead, I don't. Disappointment flashed across several faces. But I stepped beside Pioneer. Selling tomorrow because today is difficult has never ended well. Mr. Su's eyes narrowed. You think this workshop has a tomorrow? I rested my hand on the unfinished robot. I know it does. He gave a short laugh. Belief doesn't pay electricity bills. No, but panic signs bad contracts. For the first time since entering the workshop, Mr. Su stopped smiling. He picked up the folder. I'll leave the proposal. You have until the committee meeting. As he reached the door, he paused. One piece of advice. I waited. The technology industry moves very quickly. It does. If you spend too long protecting ideals, someone else builds the future. He left without another word. The door clicked shut behind him. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, Zhao Kai exhaled. I almost signed it. So did I, another student admitted. Yue looked toward me. You knew what he was doing immediately. I stared at the contract, still lying on the table. Because I've seen what happens after people sign agreements like that. She tilted her head. What happens? I looked at the empty doorway. They stop owning the future they worked to build. That night, after everyone else had gone home, I remained alone in the workshop. The contract lay open before me. Legally, it was clean. Ethically, it depended on who held power. I walked over to Pioneer. The robot stood motionless beneath the workshop lights. Incomplete. Fragile. Full of potential. Almost exactly like us. I remembered another conference room. Another polished table. Another set of documents carrying my forged signature. Ownership. It had seemed permanent. Until it wasn't. This time, if I built something valuable, it would never depend on trust alone. It would depend on structures that protected the people creating it, not just the company profiting from it. A faint knock echoed from the hallway. Professor Hahn stepped inside. I heard about Horizon. News travels fast. He smiled. Professors gossip more than students. His eyes fell on the contract. You refuse. I delay. A useful difference. He walked around Pioneer slowly. Then, without looking at me, he asked, "What are you really trying to build?" The answer came before I had time to think. A place. He looked back. A company can become greedy. A product becomes obsolete. But a place. I glanced around the aging workshop, where curious people solve impossible problems together that can outlive any founder. Professor Hahn remained silent for a long moment. Finally, he nodded. I was hoping that would be your answer. He reached into his satchel and handed me a thick envelope. What's this? The university archives. I opened it. Old photographs, blueprints, maintenance records. Then one document caught my eye. Engineering Annex, Scheduled Demolition Assessment. My heartbeat slowed. Demolition? Not closure. Complete demolition. The committee wasn't deciding whether to reduce funding. They had already begun planning what came afterward. The decision was further along than anyone in the workshop realized. Professor Hahn quietly said, "The review next week is only part of the story." I looked up. They've already chosen? Not officially, but someone has been encouraging the university to sell this land. A cold realization settled over me. This wasn't just about a struggling student club. The land itself was valuable. Very valuable. Someone wanted the workshop gone. And for the first time since waking up in my 18-year-old body, I felt the future shifting in a way I had never experienced before. Not because I remembered it, because this hadn't happened in my previous life. The timeline had already begun to change. The demolition report stayed on my desk long after Professor Hahn left. I read every page twice, then a third time. The engineering annex wasn't being closed because it lacked value. It was being evaluated as commercial property. Someone had calculated how much money the university could earn by replacing laboratories with office buildings. The robotics workshop wasn't the problem. It was simply standing where someone wanted to build something more profitable. I folded the report carefully. In my previous life, I would have marched straight to the dean's office demanding answers. Not anymore. Experience had taught me something painful. People rarely revealed their true intentions when they knew they were being watched. Sometimes the fastest way to learn the truth was to stop interrupting those determined to create it. The next morning, I arrived at the workshop to find everyone already busy. Pioneers stood in the center of the room, surrounded by tools. Yue was redesigning the shoulder joint. Zhao Kai had somehow convinced two electrical engineering students to help redesign the power distribution board. No one asked me what to do. I smiled. That was exactly what I wanted. Instead of becoming the center of every solution, I quietly picked up a broom and began sweeping away metal shavings scattered across the floor. Zhao Kai looked over. "You came early. I couldn't sleep." So, he glanced around. "Aren't you going to tell everyone what to build today?" I shook my head. "They already know." He looked confused. "But you're the smartest person here." "No, I'm simply older than my mistakes." He laughed. "I still don't understand half the things you say." "You don't have to. You'll understand them eventually." An hour later, Yue approached holding two mechanical drawings. "Which design would you choose?" I looked at both. One was lighter, the other far stronger. Either would work. In my previous life, I would have chosen within seconds. Instead, I asked, "Which one would you choose?" She frowned. "I ask you." "I know." She sighed before studying the drawings again. Several minutes passed. Finally, she pointed to the stronger version. "It costs more, but reliability matters more than weight, especially if we expect people to trust the machine." I nodded. "Then build that one." She blinked. "That's it. You already made the decision." She looked at the blueprint again. A slow smile appeared. "You've been doing this on purpose." "Doing what?" "Making us think before answering." I shrugged. "If I solve every problem, what happens when I'm not here?" The words lingered in the room. Several students quietly looked up from their work. No one spoke, but something changed. Questions became discussions. Instead of waiting for me, They started challenging each other. The workshop sounded different. Not louder. Smarter. Just before lunch, Professor Liang returned. His expression was unusually tense. The committee moved the review. This afternoon, the room froze. Today, Zhao Kai almost shouted. Professor Liang nodded. They said there was an opening in the schedule. I looked at him carefully. Who requested the change? He hesitated. I wasn't told, but his eyes answered the question before his mouth did. Someone wanted to inspect the workshop before we were ready. The atmosphere immediately shifted. One student began hiding unfinished prototypes. Another rushed to clean the workbenches. Yue looked toward me. What do we do? I slowly closed the toolbox in front of me. Nothing unusual. Everyone stared. What? We keep working. They'll think we're unprepared. They'll think we're honest. I walked toward Pioneer and tightened one loose bolt. If we start pretending today, then we'll spend the rest of our lives pretending. The room gradually calmed. No frantic cleaning. No fake demonstrations. Only genuine work. For the first time, I noticed several students standing a little taller. Truth carried its own confidence. 3 black sedans stopped outside the engineering building shortly after 2 o'clock. Committee members, department administrators, several people from the university finance office, and Mr. Su from Horizon Technologies. Interesting. He wasn't on the university staff, yet he had arrived with them. I filed the observation away without comment. The group entered together. The workshop suddenly felt much smaller. The dean looked around with visible disappointment. So this is the facility. Professor Liang nodded. Yes. The finance director scribbled something on a clipboard. One committee member quietly whispered, the renovation costs alone. Another answered, would exceed its annual budget. They weren't discussing education. They were discussing numbers. Exactly as I expected. Mr. Su wandered toward Pioneer again. It seems you've made progress. Yue answered calmly. We have. He looked at the redesigned shoulder assembly. Impressive. Then he smiled politely at the committee. You see, these students are talented. Imagine what they could accomplish inside a proper corporate laboratory. A clever sentence. On the surface, it sounded supportive. Hidden underneath, it implied the university no longer needed this workshop. The finance director nodded thoughtfully. I remained silent. Sometimes the most dangerous arguments were the ones disguised as compliments. The dean turned toward Professor Liang. Has this workshop produced anything of commercial significance? Professor Liang hesitated. Not yet. Several committee members immediately wrote notes. Wrong answer. Not dishonest. Just incomplete. Yue took one step forward. We're building something that isn't finished. The dean smiled politely. Unfortunately, potential is difficult to measure. I watched the conversation carefully. No one mentioned learning, curiosity, student development. Everything returned to measurable financial value. History had a habit of repeating itself. Only the meeting rooms changed. Then something unexpected happened. One of the youngest committee members walked away from the group. He stopped beside Pioneer. Instead of asking about costs, he crouched beside the robot's ankle joint. Who designed this reinforcement? The room became quiet. I did, Yue answered. He examined it closely. This reduces stress concentration. Yes. He looked genuinely impressed. Most commercial designs ignore this. Mr. Su's expression changed almost imperceptibly, just enough for me to notice. The young committee member stood. He looked around the workshop. I built my first robot in this room. Professor Liang looked surprised. I didn't know you were an alumnus. Gu Jian smiled. Most people don't. Then he turned back toward Pioneer. But I recognize good engineering when I see it. For the first time that afternoon, the committee wasn't looking at an old workshop. They were looking at what the workshop could produce. And I realized something. Without saying a single word, without arguing, without trying to control the meeting, the students had just become the strongest evidence this place possessed. I quietly stepped back. Sometimes, the hardest thing to do was nothing at all. And sometimes, it was exactly the right choice. The room remained quiet after Gu Jian's remark. Silence in a boardroom usually meant uncertainty. Silence in a workshop meant people were thinking. Gu Jian didn't return to the committee immediately. Instead, he walked around Pioneer slowly, crouching occasionally to inspect a weld or trace a cable with his eyes. This gearbox, he said, wasn't purchased. Yue nodded. We rebuilt it from two damaged industrial actuators. And this power regulator? We salvaged components from retired CNC equipment. Gu Jian looked genuinely impressed. You didn't have a proper budget. We had ideas. For the first time since entering the workshop, the finance director stopped writing. He looked at the robot with a little more attention. Mr. Su noticed a shift. He stepped forward with his usual composed smile. Resourcefulness is admirable, he said. But eventually, every serious research team needs capital. No one disagreed. He continued. Horizon can provide that. He turned toward the committee. The university shouldn't carry this burden alone. His words sounded generous, but they subtly reframed the discussion. The workshop was no longer an asset. It had become a burden waiting for rescue. I watched Gu Jian's expression. He heard it too. The dean folded his hands. The university's responsibility is education. Mr. Su nodded. Exactly. And partnerships strengthen education. The sentence was carefully chosen. It wasn't wrong, just incomplete. Partnerships could strengthen education. They could also quietly transfer ownership of ideas before students understood their value. I had lived through enough contracts to recognize the difference. Still, I said nothing. This wasn't my meeting. If I wanted the workshop to survive without depending on me, others had to begin asking the difficult questions. Gu Jian did exactly that. What happens to student patents under Horizon's proposal? Mr. Su answered without hesitation. The company manages commercialization and ownership. Our legal department handles intellectual property in accordance with the agreement, meaning Horizon owns it. A brief pause. The company assumes the investment risk. Gu Jian slowly nodded. I see. His expression remained neutral, but I could almost hear him rearranging the pieces in his mind. Professor Liang cleared his throat. I've taught engineering for 26 years. Everyone looked toward him. I've seen brilliant students fail. I've also seen average students change entire industries. He rested one hand on the old workbench. The difference was almost never equipment. The finance director frowned. Then what was it? Professor Liang smiled. They believed they were building something that belonged to them. The room fell silent again. Not dramatic silence. Thoughtful silence. Sometimes a single sentence weighed more than an hour of debate. The committee moved to inspect the storage area. I deliberately remained behind. So did Gu Jian. He waited until the others disappeared into the hallway. Then he spoke quietly. You're Lin Shun. I am. I've heard interesting things. Already, the capacitor, the balancing algorithm, the workshop discussions. Campus rumors traveled faster than wireless networks. He smiled faintly. I watched you during the meeting. I didn't say much. Exactly. He looked toward the corridor to ensure no one was listening. Most talented people try to prove they're the smartest person in the room. You kept giving everyone else room to speak. I shrugged. They earned it. He studied me for another moment. You remind me of someone. Who? My old mentor. He believed leadership wasn't about collecting followers. It was about creating people who no longer needed one. His words stayed with me. In my previous life, I hadn't always succeeded, or I became too dependent on my judgment. This workshop wouldn't repeat that mistake. Footsteps echoed from a hallway. The committee returned. The finance director looked less certain than before. Good. Uncertainty meant assumptions were being questioned. The dean addressed the group. We've seen the facilities. We'll announce our decision after reviewing today's findings. Mr. Su maintained his professional smile, but I noticed his fingers tighten around his briefcase handle. He had expected a quick conclusion. Instead, the conversation had become complicated. Complicated decisions took time. Time created opportunities. As everyone prepared to leave, Gu Jian unexpectedly turned back. One request. The dean looked surprised. Go ahead. I'd like these students to demonstrate Pioneer at next month's National University Robotics Forum. The room became still. Professor Liang blinked. The National Forum? Gu Jian nodded. If we're evaluating the workshop's future, we should evaluate its work where engineering is judged, not in accounting spreadsheets. He didn't need to say the last part. Everyone understood it anyway. The dean considered the suggestion. Finally, he nodded slowly. Approved. Yue looked as though she wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. Zhao Kai almost dropped the screwdriver in his hand. The workshop had just received an invitation no one thought possible. After the committee departed, excitement exploded. We're going to the National Forum. We'll finally compete. What if we actually win something? Everyone talked at once. I quietly picked up the empty teacups left behind by the visitors. Yue noticed. She walked over. Aren't you excited? I am. You don't look it. I smiled. I'm thinking. About what? The forum isn't a reward. It's a test. She nodded slowly. For the robot. For us. Success attracted attention. Attention attracted opportunity. Opportunity also attracted people who wanted ownership. We would need more than engineering skill. We would need judgment. That evening, as the workshop gradually emptied, my phone vibrated. Unknown number. I answered. Mr. Lin. It was Mr. Su. I hope I'm not interrupting. What can I do for you? I'd like to meet privately. I'm not interested in signing the contract. This isn't about the contract. His tone remained pleasant. It's about your future. I leaned against the workbench. I'm listening. You've clearly become influential inside that workshop. I've made friends. You've made more than that. A brief pause. I think you're wasting your potential. I smiled to myself. Some conversations never changed. Only the people involved. What do you propose? Coffee. No committee. No professors. Just two people discussing technology. His voice remained calm. I think you'll find my offer considerably different. The call ended. I stared at the silent phone. In my previous life, I would have accepted out of curiosity. Now, curiosity came with caution. Across the room, pioneers stood under the workshop lights, still unfinished but steadier than before. Outside, the campus grew quiet. Inside my mind, one thought kept returning. People rarely change strategy after their first plan failed. They simply changed the price. And I intended to find out exactly what Horizon believed I was worth. The cafe Mr. Su chose sat across from the university's south gate. It wasn't expensive. It was discreet. The kind of place where conversations disappeared beneath the sound of coffee grinders and quiet music. I arrived 5 minutes early. Not because I respected the meeting, because I wanted to observe. Old habits from my previous life hadn't disappeared with Rebirth. They had simply become more useful. Mr. Su entered exactly on time. No assistant. No briefcase this time. Only a tablet and 2 cups of coffee already paid for. You came. I said I would. He smiled. I appreciate people who keep their word. I almost laughed. So did Su Qiming. For several moments, neither of us discussed business. Instead, he asked about classes, campus life, and the robotics club. Normal questions, asked too naturally. He wasn't gathering information. He was measuring reactions. Eventually, he placed the tablet on the table. I'll skip the formalities. I think you're exceptional. Thank you. I also think you're in the wrong place. I stir my coffee without answering. The university workshop is too small. It has outdated equipment. It can't support someone with your ability. He leaned forward. Horizon can. There it was. The real meeting had finally begun. He slid the tablet toward me. On the screen was a scholarship agreement. Full tuition, living expenses, access to Horizon's research center, a guaranteed engineering position after graduation. For most students, it would have been life-changing. For 18-year-old me in my previous life, I would have signed before reaching the second page. Not because I was greedy, because my family had struggled financially for years. I knew exactly how tempting security could be. Mr. Su watched my expression carefully. I imagine this would help your parents. It was a precise strike. He had done his homework. My mother still works double shifts, he continued quietly. And your father recently closed his repair shop. I looked up. You investigated my family. I understand the people I invest in. His answer was smooth, professional, reasonable. Still, something inside me tightened. In my previous life, I had accepted too many people knowing everything about me while I knew almost nothing about them. Not this time. What do you want in return? I asked. He smiled. Nothing unreasonable. You'll join Horizon after graduation. You'll conduct your major research through us. And naturally, he paused. Any commercially significant inventions developed using company resources belong to the company. There was again. Ownership. Always ownership. Different contract. Same destination. I closed the tablet. It's generous. It is. But I won't sign. For the first time since we'd met, genuine surprise appeared on his face. You didn't even negotiate. I don't need to. You haven't heard my final offer. I don't think it changes the destination. He leaned back. And what destination is that? I met his eyes. A future where someone else decides what my work is worth. The cafe grew quiet around us. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then, unexpectedly, Mr. Su smiled. Not politely, not strategically, almost appreciatively. You really are different. He picked up his coffee. Do you know why I joined Horizon? I shook my head. I started exactly where you are. A university workshop. No money, no connections. Someone gave me an opportunity. He looked out the window toward the engineering building in the distance. I took it, and I've never worried about paying my bills again. His voice carried no regret, only certainty. You think I sold my future? I think I bought stability. I considered his words carefully. He wasn't lying. He genuinely believed them. That made him far more dangerous than someone acting out of simple greed. People convinced they were right rarely questioned the consequences of their choices. I don't think you're my enemy, I said. His eyebrows lifted slightly. No. I think we simply value different things. And what do you value? I answered without hesitation. The freedom to decide what comes next. He studied me for a long moment before standing. I hope you keep that freedom. He extended his hand. If you ever change your mind, the offer remains open. I shook his hand. I appreciate that. As he walked away, I noticed he didn't look disappointed. He looked thoughtful, as though he had just discovered a variable he hadn't expected. When I returned to campus, I found the workshop lights still on. Inside, everyone was gathered around Pioneer. Zhao Kai looked up the moment I entered. We got a problem. The excitement from earlier had vanished. Yue handed me a circuit board. It failed during endurance testing. I examined it. Not the board. The burn marks around the voltage regulator. Interesting. This isn't component failure. What is it? I looked toward the robot. Someone increased the input voltage. The room fell silent. By accident, one student asked. I slowly shook my head. The protection fuse was removed first. No one spoke. The implication hung heavily in the air. Someone hadn't simply made a mistake. Someone had intentionally bypassed the safety system. Professor Liang arrived moments later. I just had a call from campus security. His expression was grim. There was unauthorized access to this building last night. Yue frowned. But the doors were locked. They were. He held up a printed report. The electronic lock recorded a temporary master override. My heartbeat slowed. Not because I was surprised. Because the timeline had shifted again. In my previous life, there had never been a robotics forum. Never a sponsorship dispute. Never a reason to sabotage Pioneer. Someone had already begun reacting to changes I had created. For the first time since my rebirth, the future no longer belonged entirely to memory. It belonged to choices. Mine, and everyone else's. I gently placed the damaged circuit board on the workbench. Then I looked around at the team. No accusations. No one objected. We verify the facts first. Yue nodded. What if someone really did this? I looked at the silent robot standing in the center of the workshop. Then the truth will eventually become visible. I had learned that lesson too late in my first life. I wouldn't make the same mistake again. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is nothing. Truth has a way of finding those who stop trying to force it. The damaged voltage regulator sat in the center of the workbench. No one touched it. The workshop, usually filled with conversation, had fallen unusually quiet. Every student understood the same thing. If Pioneer had simply broken during testing, we could repair it. If someone had deliberately sabotaged it, the problem was no longer mechanical. Professor Liang laid the campus security report beside the burned circuit board. The electronic lock recorded a master override at 10:43 p.m. Yue frowned. Who has access to a master key? The facilities department, security, and he hesitated. Members of the university administration. Zhao Kai immediately slammed his hand onto the table. So, someone from the university did this? No. I answered before Professor Liang could. We don't know that. Everyone looked toward me. There was a master override. That doesn't tell us who used it. It only tells us the system recognized authorized credentials. Professor Liang nodded quietly. Exactly. Anger was understandable. Assumptions were dangerous. I had paid dearly for confusing the two in my previous life. Campus security arrived less than an hour later. Leading them was Captain Wu, a middle-aged officer whose calm expression suggested he had seen every kind of student dispute imaginable. He carefully examined Pioneer, then the damaged circuit board, then the electrical cabinet. Finally, he looked toward us. Who discovered the failure? Yue raised her hand. I did. What did you do afterward? I turned off the main power. Did anyone touch the wiring? No. He nodded approvingly. Good. He wasn't treating us like suspects. He was treating the robot like a crime scene. That small difference mattered. Captain Wu spent nearly 40 minutes documenting everything. He photographed every cable, every switch, every fuse. Then he removed the protective cover from the power control cabinet. He leaned closer. One of his officers joined him. What is it? Captain Wu pointed toward the inside of the cabinet. There. I stepped forward. The tamper-evident security seal had been sliced cleanly with a precision blade. Not torn, not broken. Cut. Professionally. Captain Wu looked up. This wasn't accidental. The words echoed through the room. Several students exchanged nervous glances. No one spoke. The dean arrived shortly afterward. His face darkened the moment he understood the situation. This happened inside university property? Captain Wu nodded. It appears someone intentionally bypassed the robot's protection circuitry. The dean looked genuinely shocked. Why would anyone do that? No one answered. Because none of us truly knew. Not yet. By evening, rumors had spread across campus. Some students claimed Pioneer had exploded. Others insisted Horizon Technologies had bribed someone. One version even suggested rival universities were involved. Rumors always traveled faster than facts. I ignored them. Instead, I returned to the workshop and quietly began repairing the damaged control board. Yue watched me for several minutes. You really aren't curious? I am. Then why aren't you trying to find the person responsible? I continued replacing damaged components. Because I'm not an investigator. She folded her arms. But if you wait, the evidence disappears. I looked up. Not if the evidence is properly preserved. She stared at me. You trust Captain Wu? I trust good procedures. That answer seemed to surprise her more than anything else. Late that night, Professor Han entered carrying a cardboard box. I thought you might need these. Inside were several old digital oscilloscopes donated by another university. They're outdated. He smiled. So is half this workshop. Everyone laughed quietly. The tension eased. Sometimes support wasn't measured by money. Sometimes it arrived inside worn cardboard boxes. As we reorganized the equipment, Zhao Kai suddenly held up a small object. What's this? He had found a black USB drive beneath one of the storage shelves. Yue frowned. That isn't ours. I took it carefully. No label. No markings. Almost new. Professor Liang immediately spoke. Don't plug it into any computer. I nodded. Agreed. Captain Wu returned 20 minutes later after receiving our call. He placed the drive inside an evidence bag without opening it. If someone left this intentionally. He looked around the room. Then it belongs in the investigation. Again, procedure, not assumptions. I found myself respecting him more with every decision. The following morning, the entire engineering faculty buzzed with speculation. Yet something else caught my attention. Near the administration building stood several surveyors. They weren't police. They weren't engineers. They carried land measurement equipment. I quietly watched them marking sections of the engineering annex. Interesting. Very interesting. The sabotage investigation had barely begun, yet someone was already preparing the land. almost as though they expected the workshop to disappear regardless of what Captain Wu discovered. That wasn't coincidence. It was confidence. And confidence usually came from believing the outcome had already been arranged. That afternoon, Gu Jian returned unexpectedly. I heard about the sabotage. We're managing. He looked toward Pioneer. How bad? The robot will recover. And the workshop? I smiled faintly. That depends on people. He nodded thoughtfully. Then he noticed the surveyors outside the window. His expression changed. Why are they measuring the annex? Professor Liang answered quietly. They claim it's part of a campus infrastructure review. Gu Jian didn't look convinced. Neither was I. He turned toward me. Walk with me. We stepped outside into the fading afternoon light. Only after we were well away from the workshop did he speak again. I made a few phone calls. And the land beneath this building, he paused, is worth almost 10 times more than the engineering budget. I remained silent. He continued. Several private developers have already expressed interest. So the workshop was never the real target. No. He looked back toward the old building. It was simply standing on valuable ground. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Gu Jian asked quietly, have you noticed something else? What? The sabotage happened just days before the university's final funding decision. The timing. Of course, if Pioneer failed publicly, the workshop would appear incapable of meaningful research. Closing it would suddenly seem reasonable. I slowly exhaled. This wasn't just an act of vandalism. It was part of something larger. Someone wasn't trying to destroy a robot. They were trying to shape a decision. And for the first time, I could almost see the outline of the person pulling the strings. The survey stakes remained in the ground for the rest of the week. Students walked past them without paying much attention. Faculty members assumed they were part of routine maintenance. Only a handful of people understood what they really represented. Someone wasn't planning for a possibility. They were preparing for an outcome. Captain Wu called me the following afternoon. We've finished the first round of forensic analysis. Did you find anything? I'd rather discuss it in person. His tone gave away nothing. When I arrived at the campus security office, he slid several photographs across the table. The first showed the sliced security seal. The second showed microscopic scratches on the cabinet screws. The third stopped me cold. A close-up image of a tiny metallic shaving trapped inside the control cabinet. What am I looking at? Captain Wu enlarged the photograph. This alloy isn't from your workshop. He placed another report beside it. It matches filings produced by a specialized insulated precision driver. I frowned. Most students wouldn't own one. Correct. He folded his hands. But maintenance contractors often do. Interesting. Very interesting. Captain Wu wasn't finished. We also examined the USB drive. And it contained architectural drawings. Of the workshop? He nodded, along with internal correspondence discussing demolition schedules. I looked up sharply. Who wrote them? The files were deleted, but not completely. He turned the monitor toward me. Recovered metadata filled the screen. Most of it was incomplete, except for one recurring company name, Jinhai Urban Development, the same developer whose surveyors had been measuring the annex. Captain Wu tapped the screen. We're now trying to determine how these documents left university servers. I remained silent, not because I lacked theories, because theories had nearly destroyed me once before. Evidence mattered, nothing else. Captain Wu studied my expression. You aren't asking who I suspect. I'd rather know what you can prove. A faint smile crossed his face. I wish more people thought that way. Back at the workshop, I found the team unusually energetic. Yue was recalibrating Pioneer's gate. Zhao Kai had rebuilt the damage power regulator using spare components from 3 discarded industrial controllers. The sabotage had slowed them. It hadn't stopped them. That alone felt like a victory. Yue glanced up as I entered. Any news? There is. I placed a notebook on the table instead of repeating Captain Wu's findings. What is this? A reliability checklist. She blinked. I asked about the investigation. I know. She looked confused. I pointed toward Pioneer. If we're going to demonstrate this robot nationally, we'll need it to survive more than one presentation. Understanding slowly appeared on her face. The investigation continues. Our work continues too. Exactly. If we allowed every obstacle to dictate our direction, we would never build anything lasting. That evening, Professor Hahn visited again. He watched the students testing Pioneer before quietly sitting beside me. "You've changed. So, how's the workshop?" "No." He smiled. "I mean your instincts." I looked toward the robot taking careful steps across the concrete floor. "In what way?" "When you were 18, the first time." He paused, realizing how strange that sentence sounded. "You always rushed toward the biggest problem. And now you ask whether the problem actually belongs to you." I considered his words. He was right. Not every fire needed me to be the one holding the bucket. Some people had to discover they were capable of putting out flames themselves. A sudden burst of applause interrupted us. Pioneer had completed a full 20-meter walking test without a single stability correction. The workshop erupted in celebration. Yue laughed openly. Zhao Kai bowed dramatically toward the robot. Even Professor Liang allowed himself a rare smile. I stayed where I was, watching, not because I wasn't proud, because this success didn't belong to me. It belonged to everyone in the room, and that felt far more satisfying than another personal achievement. The next morning, campus news exploded. A student journalist had somehow obtained copies of the demolition assessment. By lunchtime, the headline had spread across every university forum. Historic engineering workshop may be replaced by commercial complex. Students flooded the comments. Alumni began sharing memories. Former club members posted photographs of projects they had built inside the annex over the past 20 years. Something unexpected happened. The conversation stopped being about an old building. It became about what the building represented. Opportunity, curiosity, the place where countless engineers had failed safely before eventually succeeding elsewhere. Public opinion was shifting, not because anyone had manipulated it, because people were finally seeing information that had quietly existed all along. Truth had begun doing its own work. That afternoon, the university announced an emergency hearing. Faculty, students, alumni representatives, the administration. Everyone would have an opportunity to speak before the final decision. Professor Liang looked relieved. "This buys us time." Gu Jian shook his head. "It buys us scrutiny." He looked directly at me. "And scrutiny changes everything." I knew exactly what he meant. People comfortable making quiet decisions rarely enjoyed public attention. The hearing wouldn't decide the future by itself, but it would force every interested party to defend their position in the open. Some arguments became much weaker once sunlight reached them. As the workshop closed for the night, Captain Wu called again. "We've identified the maintenance contractor who signed out the master access credentials." My grip tightened around the phone. "Did he enter the building?" "Yes." "And he claims he was following instructions." "From whom?" A brief silence. "We're verifying that." He didn't say the name. He didn't need to. The investigation had finally reached a point where responsibility was climbing upward, not downward, exactly where it often belonged. Outside the workshop window, rain began falling softly over the old engineering annex. Students hurried across campus with backpacks over their heads. Inside, Pioneers stood quietly beneath the lights. No longer just a student project. It had become evidence that the workshop still had a future worth protecting. And somewhere beyond those rain-covered windows, someone was beginning to realize that a plan designed to disappear quietly was about to be examined in full public view. The university auditorium had never been so full. Students lined the aisles. Professors stood against the walls. Alumni who had graduated decades earlier returned after seeing the news spread across social media. No one came to watch a robot. They came because they believed something valuable was about to disappear. At the center of the stage sat the review committee, the dean, the finance director, representatives from the engineering faculty. Gu Jian occupied one of the alumni seats. Mr. Su from Horizon Technologies sat quietly in the last row. He wasn't part of the hearing. He had come to observe. The dean adjusted the microphone. Today's hearing concerns the future of the engineering annex and the innovation workshop. His voice echoed through the auditorium. We ask that all speakers remain respectful. One by one, faculty members presented financial reports, maintenance costs, utility expenses, renovation estimates. Every chart pointed toward the same conclusion. The building was old, expensive, difficult to justify. Numbers rarely lied, but they rarely told the whole story either. Professor Liang stood next. Unlike the others, he carried no presentation slides, only a worn notebook. I've taught in this building for 26 years. He looked toward the audience rather than the committee. I could spend an hour discussing budgets. I won't. Instead, he opened the notebook. Inside were photographs, students working late into the night, homemade robots assembled from discarded parts, award ceremonies, research teams, graduation pictures. This workshop never produced the university's largest grants. It produced something else. He turned another page. Engineers. Silence settled over the auditorium. Not dramatic silence. Respectful silence. The purpose of education, Professor Liang continued, is not to maximize the value of land. It's to maximize the potential of people. Several audience members applauded. The committee remained expressionless, but even they listened more carefully now. Next came former students. One had founded a medical device company. Another led an aerospace manufacturing team. A third designed disaster response drones. None of them spoke about buildings. They spoke about failure, about burning out motors, breaking prototypes, sleeping on workshop floors before competitions. The first machine I ever built caught fire, one alumnus admitted, drawing laughter from the audience. I nearly quit engineering. He smiled. Professor Liang told me to build another one. I did. That decision changed my life. One story became another, then another. The workshop slowly transformed from an aging facility into a place filled with memories. Places mattered because people gave them meaning. The finance director finally leaned toward his microphone. No one questions these experiences, but sentiment alone cannot maintain aging infrastructure. A fair point. No one argued. Emotion wasn't enough. The workshop needed a future, not only a past. The dean looked toward our group. The robotics club, Maine now present. Yue looked at me. I gave a small nod. She understood. This wasn't my moment. It was hers. She walked confidently onto the stage. No prepared speech. No dramatic performance. Only pioneer. The robot stood beside her under the auditorium lights. This machine isn't finished. She smiled. Neither are we. Soft laughter spread through the audience. She continued. Everything inside this robot was designed, repaired, or rebuilt by students. We didn't have the newest equipment, so we learned to understand the equipment we had. We didn't have large budgets, so we learned creativity. She rested one hand lightly on Pioneer's shoulder. If this workshop disappears, future students won't lose a building. They'll lose a place where failure is still allowed. The applause began before she stepped away from the microphone. I watched quietly from backstage. She no longer needed me to speak for her. That was the greatest success I could have hoped for. Then Captain Wu entered the auditorium. Several committee members looked surprised. The dean frowned slightly. This is an administrative hearing. Captain Wu nodded. I understand, but our investigation has produced findings directly relevant to today's discussion. The room became completely silent. He connected a laptop to the projector. Photographs appeared on the screen. The sliced security seal, the damaged power cabinet, the recovered USB drive. Then, recovered emails. Not rumors, not speculation. Evidence. One message discussed accelerating demolition approvals before the robotics forum. Another recommended documenting equipment failures to strengthen the case for closure. No names have been hidden. Every sender was clearly identified. The facility's contractor, a university procurement manager, and a consulting representative employed by Jinhai Urban Development. A ripple moved through the audience. The finance director's face turned pale. He slowly lowered his eyes. Captain Wu spoke calmly. Our investigation found no evidence that any student or faculty member participated in the sabotage. He paused. We did, however, find evidence of unauthorized cooperation between external commercial interests and internal administrative personnel. Gasps spread across the room. The dean stared at the projected emails in disbelief. When were these obtained? This morning, Captain Wu answered. The digital forensics team recovered deleted correspondence from multiple servers. No shouting, no dramatic accusations, just facts. Truth didn't need louder voices. It only needed documentation. The procurement manager stood abruptly. This is being taken out of context. Captain Wu looked toward him. Then you'll have every opportunity to explain it during the formal investigation. Security officers quietly approached. The manager looked around the room. For a moment, he seemed ready to argue. Instead, he slowly sat back down. His own emails had already spoken. No one looked at the workshop anymore. Every eye in the auditorium had shifted toward the officials responsible for the deal. The narrative had changed completely. The workshop was no longer defending itself. Others were now explaining their actions. Exactly as it should be. Gu Jian quietly walked onto the stage after Captain Wu finished. As an alumnus, he looked around the auditorium. I'd like to make one recommendation. The dean nodded. Go ahead. I recommend suspending all demolition discussions immediately and establishing the Innovation Workshop as an independent university research center protected from commercial property redevelopment. The audience erupted into applause. This time, even several committee members joined in. The motion wasn't a final decision, but the momentum had shifted decisively. From the back row, I noticed Mr. Su quietly stand. Our eyes met briefly across the crowded auditorium. He didn't look angry. If anything, he looked disappointed. Not because his company had lost, because he had finally understood something. The real value of the workshop had never been the land, or even the robot. It was the people learning to build futures no contract could easily purchase. He gave me a small nod, then left without saying a word. Sometimes walking away revealed more character than winning ever could. As the auditorium slowly emptied, Yue found me backstage. We did it. I smiled. No, we earn another chance. She laughed. You're impossible. Probably. She looked toward Pioneer, standing beneath the stage lights. So, what now? I looked at the old robot, then toward the students celebrating with Professor Liang and Professor Han. The workshop had survived, but surviving was never the destination. It was simply permission to begin. Truth does not create damage. It reveals where damage already exists. The celebration ended before sunset, not because people had lost their excitement, because everyone understood the same thing. Saving the workshop had only bought us time. Time, like funding, could be wasted if no one knew how to use it. The morning after the hearing, the atmosphere inside the engineering annex felt different. The cracked walls hadn't changed. Neither had the aging equipment. Yet every workbench was occupied. Students who had never shown interest in the workshop now stood outside the door waiting to join. Some carried notebooks. Others carried unfinished prototypes. One freshman nervously held a cardboard box containing a small four-wheeled robot assembled from discarded printer motors. Yue looked at the growing crowd and whispered, "We've never had this many people." I smiled. People rarely gather around certainty. They gather around possibility. Professor Liang entered carrying a stack of application forms nearly 10 centimeters thick. I thought we'd have 5 new members. He sighed. There are 63. Zhao Kai nearly dropped his coffee. 63? Professor Liang nodded. And more are asking if they can still apply. The room erupted into excited conversation. I remained quiet. Growth looked exciting from a distance. Up close, it created new problems. That afternoon, everyone expected me to assign projects. Instead, I erased the whiteboard completely. Then I wrote 3 questions. What problem are we solving? Who benefits if we solve it? Can someone else build it better? The workshop became strangely quiet. A freshman raised his hand. Aren't we supposed to start building robots? We are. Then why these questions? I picked up an old servo motor from the workbench. Anyone can build a machine. The difficult part is building the right one. Several students immediately began discussing ideas. Agricultural automation, medical assistance, warehouse logistics, search and rescue systems. No one agreed. That was exactly what I wanted. Good ideas became stronger after surviving disagreement. Professor Han watched from the doorway. After everyone became absorbed in discussion, he quietly walked beside me. I've been thinking, that's usually dangerous. He laughed. It certainly has been. He handed me a folded document. The university approved something. I opened it. My eyes stopped on the first line. Innovation Workshop Charter. The Robotics Club would no longer operate as an ordinary student organization. It had officially become an independent university innovation laboratory. Protected funding, dedicated space, intellectual property retained by creators unless voluntarily licensed. I looked back at Professor Han. You fought for this. A lot of people did. He smiled. You simply reminded them why it mattered. Across the room, Yue was helping two freshmen repair a damaged actuator. She wasn't giving them answers. She kept asking questions, exactly as I had done with her. I found myself smiling. Leadership spread quietly, like craftsmanship. 3 days later, Gu Jian returned. This time, he didn't come alone. Behind him stood two engineers carrying rugged equipment cases. The workshop immediately fell silent. Gu Jian placed one case on the table and opened it. Inside lay a compact, industrial-grade laser scanner. Several students gasped. Equipment like this normally existed only inside major research facilities. We're donating it. Yue looked stunned. To us. Not to the workshop. Gu Jian smiled. To the people inside it. He turned toward me. No conditions. No ownership. No hidden contracts. Just one request. What is it? When one of you changes the world, remember where you started? The atmosphere in the workshop changed again. Not because of the scanner. Because of trust. Real trust asked for nothing in return. I silently promised myself something. If I ever built another company, it would never forget the difference. That evening, we held our first formal planning session. Instead of discussing competitions, we focused on problems. Healthcare, manufacturing, elderly assistance, disaster recovery. Hours passed. Arguments grew louder. Ideas became sharper. Near midnight, Zhao Kai suddenly placed a simple metal component on the table. What if? He hesitated. We stopped trying to build one perfect robot. Everyone looked toward him. What if we build modules instead? Interchangeable joints, interchangeable sensors, interchangeable control systems. Different robots sharing the same intelligent core. The room became silent. Not because the idea was perfect, because everyone immediately understood its potential. I slowly stood. Without saying a word, I drew a circle on the whiteboard. Inside it, I wrote, Common Intelligence Platform. Around it, I drew smaller circles. Factory robot, medical assistant, inspection drone, warehouse carrier, agricultural unit, one brain, many bodies. My heart began beating faster. In my previous life, Orion had reached this architecture nearly 12 years after its founding. It had transformed the company. Now, the idea existed while we were still students. Not copied, rediscovered. Together, the discussion continued until sunrise. No one noticed the passing hours. Every improvement suggested by one student inspired 3 more from someone else. No one cared whose idea came first, only whether it made the system stronger. Watching them reminded me of Orion's earliest days. Before politics, before shareholders, before fear. Just engineers solving difficult problems because solving them felt worthwhile. I silently vowed to protect that feeling for as long as I could. As everyone finally packed their bags, Professor Liang looked around the workshop. You know, he smiled. This place doesn't feel small anymore. I followed his gaze. The room was still cramped. The ceiling still leaked whenever it rained. The machines were still old. Yet somehow, the workshop had outgrown its walls. Not physically, spiritually. The future no longer felt like something waiting beyond graduation. It had already begun here. Quietly, patiently, one decision at a time. Late that afternoon, while I organized our design notes, a familiar company logo appeared on my phone. Horizon Technologies. Not Mr. Su. The message came directly from the company's executive office. We understand you've declined previous offers. Our chairman would still like to meet you personally. He believes your workshop is building something worth discussing. I read the message twice. then locked my phone. Across the room, Pioneer completed another flawless walking test. No applause this time. The team simply nodded and moved to the next problem. That made me happier than any celebration. Success was slowly becoming normal, and that was far more dangerous and far more powerful than a single breakthrough. The invitation from Horizon remained unanswered for 2 days. Not because I was trying to appear important, because I wanted to understand why the company's chairman suddenly cared about a university laboratory. Mr. Su had already failed to recruit me. A chairman rarely repeated the work of a middle manager unless something significant had changed. I intended to discover what that was. On the third morning, I accepted the meeting, not at Horizon's headquarters. I suggested the University Innovation Lab instead. If they want to see me, they could see the place they hoped to recruit me away from. The reply came within an hour. Agreed. That single word told me more than a page of explanations. They weren't inviting me into their world. They were coming to inspect mine. The workshop spent the next 2 days preparing, not by cleaning frantically, but by working normally. Pioneer had evolved far beyond its original design. The robot now walked with a smoother gait, consumed less power, and recovered from balance disturbances almost instantly. More importantly, the modular architecture was beginning to take shape. One control system, interchangeable applications. Instead of creating a different robot for every industry, we were creating a common technological foundation. Exactly the approach I wished Orion had adopted much earlier in my first life. Yue looked over the latest schematics. If this works, it changes everything. It changes manufacturing, I corrected. Everything comes later. She smiled. You always think 10 years ahead. I almost answered. Instead, I simply said, I've seen what happens when people only think about tomorrow. That afternoon, the Horizon delegation arrived. 3 executives, 2 legal advisors, Mr. Su, and finally, Chairman Chunrong. Unlike the image I remembered from business magazines years in the future, he wore no expensive watch or tailored suit that demanded attention. His first action surprised everyone. Instead of greeting me, he walked directly toward Pioneer. He circled the robot twice before speaking. Who designed the knee actuator? Yue raised her hand. I did. He nodded once. Good engineering. Then he pointed toward Zhao Kai. The power distribution board? I rebuilt it. Efficient. One by one, he asked who had contributed to each subsystem. He wasn't looking for a genius. He was looking for a team. Only after everyone had spoken did he finally turn toward me. So, you're Lin Shun. I am. He smiled. I expected someone who talked more. We moved into the meeting room Professor Liang had prepared. Chairman Shun placed a folder on the table. I'm not here to hire you. That immediately caught my attention. Then why are you here? He looked around at the workshop through the glass wall. Because 20 years ago, I started in a room that looked very similar. Professor Han quietly nodded. I remember. You borrowed half your equipment and broke the other half. The chairman laughed. I did. For a few moments, the conversation became surprisingly personal. Not about contracts, about beginnings. Finally, Chairman Chun became serious. I reviewed your modular robotics proposal. My eyes narrowed slightly. It isn't public. Mr. Su answered calmly. The patent abstract was filed yesterday. Of course. Professor Han had submitted the provisional filing. Perfect. The idea was protected before anyone outside the university saw it. Chairman Chun looked genuinely pleased. That was smart. He leaned forward. I won't ask you to sell it. I won't ask you to license it. I came because I'd like Horizon to become your manufacturing partner if you ever decide to commercialize it. The room fell silent. That I hadn't expected. Professor Liang folded his arms. No ownership? No. Board seats? No. Control over research? Absolutely not. Chairman Chun answered each question without hesitation. Then he looked directly at me. I built Horizon by making one mistake repeatedly. Everyone listened. I believe capital created innovation. He shook his head. It doesn't. It only accelerates whatever already exists. He looked around the workshop. You already have innovation. I have factories. The simplicity of the statement carried surprising weight. I studied him carefully. Unlike the contracts Mr. Su had previously offered, this proposal wasn't trying to own our future. It was trying to participate in it. There was a difference, a very important one. Still, I didn't answer immediately. Chairman Shun smiled knowingly. You don't trust quick decisions. No, you shouldn't. He stood. My proposal remains open. When you're ready to manufacture, call me. No pressure, no deadlines, no hidden urgency. As the delegation prepared to leave, Mr. Su paused beside me. You were right. About what? He glanced back at the workshop. The value was never the building. It was what the building allowed people to become. For the first time since we'd met, there was no recruitment, no persuasion, only respect. A week later, the National University Robotics Forum finally arrived. Hundreds of teams from across the country filled the exhibition hall. Autonomous drones, medical assistants, industrial manipulators, advanced humanoid prototypes funded by corporations with budgets larger than our university's annual engineering allocation. Zhao Kai swallowed hard. We're going to get crushed. I looked around calmly. No, we're going to learn. The distinction mattered. Winning one competition didn't build an empire. Learning faster than everyone else eventually could. As Pioneer rolled onto the demonstration platform, I noticed several familiar faces in the audience. Investors, researchers, technology journalists, and representatives from international companies. The workshop no longer existed in obscurity. People were watching, not because we claimed to be extraordinary, because our work had quietly earned attention. I looked at the students adjusting the robot one final time. No one asked me what to do. No one waited for instructions. They already knew, exactly as I'd hoped. The future I wanted wasn't one where everyone depended on Lin Shun. It was one where Lin Shun had built a team capable of surpassing him. And as the countdown for our demonstration began, I realized that future was already starting to arrive. The announcer's voice echoed across the exhibition hall. Next demonstration, Eastern Science University Innovation Laboratory. A large screen behind the stage displayed our team's name. No company logo, no corporate sponsor, just a university laboratory that, only weeks earlier, had been fighting for the right to exist. Yue looked at me. Nervous? A little. She laughed. I thought nothing made you nervous. I've learned that's usually when people make their biggest mistakes. She nodded. So have I. Without another word, she stepped onto the stage. The judges sat behind a long table. Most wore neutral expressions. One was an expert in industrial automation. Another specialized in artificial intelligence. The oldest judge had spent 3 decades developing precision manufacturing systems. None of them looked interested in dramatic presentations. That suited us perfectly. We hadn't come to perform. We had come to demonstrate. Pioneer began with a simple walking sequence. Steady, balanced, controlled, nothing flashy. Several teams had already shown robots capable of faster movement. Then the second phase began. A judge deliberately removed one of the robot sensor modules. Most humanoid robots would require recalibration. Pioneer paused for less than 2 seconds. Its software automatically reconfigured the remaining systems and continued walking. The audience murmured. The industrial automation expert leaned forward. He whispered something to the AI specialist. I recognized the expression. Professional curiosity. Yue spoke calmly. Our architecture isn't designed around one perfect robot. She pointed toward the modular joint assembly displayed on a nearby table. It's designed around reusable intelligence. She replaced the damaged sensor with a different module. Pioneer immediately recognized the new hardware and adapted without requiring a complete software rebuild. The audience became noticeably quieter. They were no longer watching a student project. They were watching a platform. During the question and answer session, one judge asked, "Who designed the adaptive control framework?" Yue looked toward me. For just a second, then she looked back at the judges. We all did. It wasn't entirely true, nor was it entirely false. I had provided the foundation. The team had transformed it into something stronger. That answer mattered more than personal credit, because it was the truth. The oldest judge adjusted his glasses. Most research teams protect knowledge internally. You seem to distribute it. I answered this time. If knowledge depends on one person, then it isn't strong enough yet. The judge smiled. I haven't heard that answer in many years. He wrote something in his notebook. I couldn't see what, but I noticed every other judge doing the same. The demonstrations continued throughout the afternoon. Some teams presented faster robots. Others displayed more polished hardware. One corporate-backed university revealed a humanoid with expensive imported actuators that easily surpassed our raw performance. Zhao Kai sighed. They're better. They're richer, I corrected. He looked at me. There's a difference. Performance wins demonstrations. Architecture wins decades. He thought about that quietly, then nodded. As the exhibition floor began closing for the day, a crowd gathered around our booth. Students from other universities asked technical questions. Professors requested copies of our published papers. Two overseas researchers exchanged business cards with Professor Liang. No one asked who had one yet. They wanted to understand how we'd built something so adaptable with such limited resources. That question pleased me far more than any trophy. Later that evening, the judging committee announced the results. Third place, a nationally funded robotics institute. Second place, a prestigious engineering university supported by 3 multinational companies. Then, the announcer paused. First place, he smiled. Eastern Science University Innovation Laboratory. For a heartbeat, no one on our team reacted, as though the words hadn't fully registered. Then Zhao Kai shouted. Yue covered her mouth in disbelief. Professor Liang actually removed his glasses to wipe away tears. Professor Han laughed louder than I'd ever heard. The students rushed onto the stage together. No single person stood in front. No single person accepted the award alone, exactly as it should be. After the ceremony, reporters surrounded our group. Questions came from every direction. Who funded your research? How long have you been developing this system? What company will manufacture it? I stepped back and let Yue and Professor Liang answer. The cameras barely noticed I had moved. That made me smile. Leadership wasn't measured by visibility. It was measured by resilience after you stepped aside. Near the exit, Chairman Chun waited quietly. He held out his hand. Congratulations. Thank you. He looked at the trophy. I'll ask one last time. Not to buy your company, because you don't even have one yet. He smiled. But when you decide to build one, I'd like Horizon to manufacture your first products. This time, I didn't refuse, nor did I accept immediately. Instead, I extended my hand. When that day comes, you'll be the first person I call. He nodded once. That's enough. There were no contracts, no signatures, only mutual respect. Sometimes the strongest partnerships began long before paperwork. A week after returning to campus, Gu Jian burst into the workshop carrying a newspaper. He didn't bother catching his breath. Look, the front page business headline read, University Robotics Team Wins National Forum. Investors turn attention towards student innovation. Below it, another article caught my eye. Several technology manufacturers had announced new interest in modular robotics. The industry was beginning to move, earlier than it had in my first life. The timeline was changing again, not because I forced it, because hundreds of people were now making different decisions. That evening, after everyone left, I remained alone in the workshop. Pioneer stood quietly beneath the lights. Beside it lay fresh sketches. Not for another competition, not for another student project, for something larger. A manufacturing roadmap, a software platform, a company structure built around shared innovation instead of individual brilliance. I picked up a marker and wrote a single name across the top of the whiteboard. Nova Dynamics. Not because I wanted another empire, because I wanted to build one that would never repeat the mistakes of Orion. Outside, rain tapped softly against the workshop windows. Inside, the future finally had a name. Peace begins when winning stops mattering. What you build afterward reveals who you truly are. The first product meeting at Nova Dynamics took place in the same workshop where Pioneer had learned to take its first steps. Nothing about the room suggested a company that would one day reshape industries. The ceiling still leaked during heavy rain. The oldest milling machine still required a firm kick before it started. The conference table wasn't a conference table at all. It was 3 workbenches pushed together. Yet no one complained, because everyone in that room understood something investors often forgot. Companies weren't born in skyscrapers. They were born in rooms where impossible ideas survived long enough to become practical. Professor Liang placed the university charter beside a stack of incorporation papers. So, he adjusted his glasses. Today we're no longer just a laboratory. Yue smiled. We're becoming a company. Professor Han quietly added, a company owned by the people building it. That sentence mattered. During my first life, Orion had slowly drifted away from its engineers. Quarterly reports began outweighing long-term innovation. Departments competed instead of collaborating. By the time I recognized the problem, changing it had become nearly impossible. Nova Dynamics would begin differently, and if I had anything to say about it, it would stay different. I walked to the whiteboard. Instead of writing revenue targets or market share, I wrote 4 principles. Build what matters. Share credit. Protect curiosity. Never let money decide the mission. The room grew quiet. Zhao Kai raised an eyebrow. No financial goals? There will be. But those come after this. I tapped the 4 sentences. If we lose these, nothing else will matter. No one argued. Later that afternoon, Chairman Chun arrived alone. He looked around the workshop with a nostalgic smile. It reminds me of Horizon's first office. Professor Han laughed. I remember that office. It had 1 working computer and a roof that leaked worse than ours. Chairman Chun shook his head. It did. He turned toward me. I've brought the manufacturing agreement. He slid the contract across the table. No exclusivity clauses. No ownership transfers. No hidden licensing traps. Exactly as promised. I read every page carefully. Old habits. Necessary habits. Finally, I signed. Chairman Chun signed beside me. Then he extended his hand. Congratulations. To both of us. This wasn't an acquisition. It wasn't even an investment. It was the beginning of a partnership built on mutual respect. News of Nova Dynamics spread faster than any of us expected. Not because of advertising, because engineers talked. The robotics forum had earned attention. The hearing had earned credibility. The modular platform had earned curiosity. Within weeks, emails began arriving from hospitals, logistics companies, and manufacturing firms. Each asked a different question. Could the platform be adapted? The answer was almost always the same. Yes, that had been the point from the beginning. Our first commercial prototype wasn't a humanoid robot. To the disappointment of many reporters, it wasn't glamorous at all. It was an autonomous warehouse transport unit. Simple, reliable, modular. Factories immediately understood its value. Instead of replacing entire systems, they could upgrade individual modules. Repairs that once required days now took hours. Operating costs dropped. Productivity increased. Customers returned. Not because our machines looked futuristic, because they solved real problems. One evening, after a long day of testing, Yue found me alone in the workshop. She leaned against the doorway. You know what everyone keeps saying? I looked up from the circuit board in my hands. What? They say Nova Dynamics is your company. I smiled faintly. They're wrong. She walked over to the whiteboard and pointed at the list of engineers assigned to the next project. There are 43 names. She looked back at me. You still think of it as a workshop. I hope I always will. She laughed softly. Maybe that's why it keeps growing. Months passed. Not in leaps, but in steady scenes of progress. Each customer visit brought new challenges. Each prototype uncovered flaws. Each flaw led to better designs. We celebrated breakthroughs. We admitted mistakes. No one was punished for honest failure. That single policy transformed the company more than any technological decision. People experimented. People questioned. People improved. Innovation stopped being an event. It became a habit. One afternoon, Gu Jian arrived carrying a business magazine. He placed it on my desk without a word. The cover featured Nova Dynamics. The headline read, From Campus Workshop to National Innovation Leader. I looked up. We've barely begun. Gu Jian smiled. Exactly. He tapped the magazine. The world is finally beginning to notice. I closed it gently. Recognition was pleasant, but it wasn't the destination. There was still too much left to build. Outside the workshop windows, a fresh group of university students gathered for their first internship. Some looked nervous. Some looked excited. All of them reminded me of the people we had once been. I opened the door. "Come in." One hesitant student stepped forward. "Sir." He glanced around the workshop. I thought a famous company would have a much bigger headquarters. I smiled. "We're working on that." Then I looked around the room. At Pioneer, standing in the corner. At the old workbenches. At the engineers discussing impossible ideas as though they were ordinary problems. For now, this is exactly where we belong. And somehow, it was enough. 5 years after Nova Dynamics was founded, the old engineering annex no longer looked forgotten. The cracked concrete had been repaired. New laboratories stood beside the original workshop. The leaking roof was finally gone. But one room remained almost exactly as it had been. The first workshop. 3 old workbenches. The whiteboard with our original 4 principles, carefully preserved beneath a sheet of glass. Every new engineer spent their first day there. Not because the room contained our greatest technology, because it contained our greatest lesson. Great companies were built before they became successful. Nova Dynamics expanded carefully. Whenever investors urged us to grow faster, we asked a different question. Can our culture survive the next 100 employees? If the answer was uncertain, we waited. Many people called the strategy too conservative. They didn't understand that I'd already lived through what happened when growth outran purpose. This time, patience was an advantage. Our modular intelligence platform spread into industries we had never originally imagined. Hospitals adapted it for rehabilitation systems. Agricultural companies created autonomous harvest assistants. Emergency services deployed rescue robots capable of navigating collapsed buildings. Factories no longer purchased isolated machines. They invested in an ecosystem that evolved with every software update. The architecture born inside a tiny university workshop became an industry standard. Exactly as I'd once dreamed. Only this time, it belonged to thousands of engineers, not one exhausted founder. One afternoon, Chairman Chun visited the headquarters. Unlike his first visit years ago, this time he was greeted by hundreds of employees crossing the Central Innovation Hall. He looked around with quiet satisfaction. "I've seen many companies become larger." He smiled. "Very few become wiser." We walked through the research center together. Young engineers debated algorithms on transparent digital boards. Prototype drones flew inside enclosed testing chambers. Medical robotics teams collaborated directly with manufacturing specialists. Departments mixed naturally. No walls. No political territories. Chairman Chin noticed immediately. "You designed the building to force people to meet." I nodded. "Good ideas shouldn't need appointments." He laughed. "I wish I'd thought of that 20 years ago." As Nova Dynamics grew, Horizon grew with us. The manufacturing partnership transformed both companies. Horizon became known for precision production. Nova Dynamics became known for innovation. Neither tried to become the other. Respect had proven more profitable than ownership. Mr. Su eventually became Horizon's chief strategy officer. During one conference, he quietly admitted, "I spent years trying to recruit talented people." He looked around the exhibition hall filled with Nova engineers. "You taught me it's even more important to build places where talent wants to stay." Not everyone adapted. Jinhai Urban Development collapsed after the corruption investigation uncovered years of fraudulent land acquisitions. Several former university officials received criminal convictions for abuse of authority and procurement fraud. I wasn't present during the trials. I wasn't called as a witness. Captain Wu's investigation had relied on documents, digital records, and financial evidence. The truth had never required me to stand in a courtroom seeking revenge. Their own decisions had written the verdict long before the judge did. One evening, I received a short message from Captain Wu. "Justice doesn't erase the past. It prevents it from becoming the future." I saved the message. It deserved remembering. Professor Liang officially retired at the age of 68. The university organized a ceremony in the renovated Innovation Center. Hundreds of former students returned. Some now led multinational engineering teams. Others had founded startups. Many simply came to thank the teacher who had believed in them before anyone else did. When Professor Liang stepped to the podium, he looked almost embarrassed by the applause. I only have one regret. The room became quiet. I wish I had trusted young people even sooner. His eyes found me in the audience. Then Yue. Then dozens of former students. The future has always been arriving. He smiled gently. The mistake is thinking it needs our permission. No one forgot those words. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, I returned to the original workshop. The lights were dim. Pioneer still stood in the corner. No longer our most advanced machine. Not even close. But no one suggested replacing it. It reminded us where courage had first taken shape. I rested one hand on its shoulder. In another life, this was where ambition had begun. In this life, it was where purpose had begun. There was a profound difference. As I prepared to leave, I heard footsteps behind me. Yue. She smiled. You always come back here. I do. Why? I looked around the quiet room. Because success has a strange habit. It makes people believe they were always destined to win. She nodded slowly. And this place reminds you otherwise. It reminds me that everything important started with uncertainty. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence felt comfortable. Not empty, just shared. Outside the windows, new students crossed the campus carrying toolboxes toward evening workshops. A new generation had already begun building things we couldn't yet imagine. Exactly as it should be. Across the city, financial news channels discussed a different headline. Nova Dynamics announces global expansion across 4 continents. Analysts debated market share. Investors predicted record valuations. Competitors rushed to imitate our modular platform. They were already years behind, not because they lacked intelligence, because they were trying to copy products instead of principles. Principles couldn't be reverse engineered. They had to be lived. And ours had been forged long before the world learned our name. The invitation arrived without a company logo, only a simple envelope. Inside was a letter from the university. Innovation Workshop, 20th Anniversary. We hope you will return to speak to the next generation of engineers. I folded the letter carefully. 20 years. It didn't feel possible. In some ways, I was still the 18-year-old standing in a dusty workshop beside an unfinished robot. In others, I had already lived 2 lifetimes. The campus had changed. New research buildings surrounded the old engineering district. The original annex had been restored instead of demolished. A glass walkway now connected it to the Innovation Center. Students hurried between laboratories, carrying laptops, circuit boards, and prototype components. The energy felt familiar, not because the buildings were the same, because the curiosity was. When I entered the original workshop, conversation stopped, not out of fear, out of recognition. The room had been preserved almost exactly as it had been. The 3 joined workbenches. Professor Liang's old whiteboard. Pioneer, carefully restored and displayed beside a plaque that read, "Every breakthrough begins with permission to fail." I stood there for a long moment. Without realizing it, I smiled. Professor Han, now noticeably older but no less energetic, walked over carrying 2 cups of tea. I was wondering how long you'd stand there. I lost track of time. You always did. He handed me a cup. The students are waiting. Are they expecting a speech? They're expecting answers. I laughed softly. They'll probably leave with more questions. He grinned. Then you'll fit in perfectly. The auditorium was filled with young engineers. Some hoped to build robots. Others wanted to start companies. Many simply wanted to understand how a tiny university workshop had become the birthplace of the world's most influential innovation company. The moderator introduced me with a list of accomplishments that seemed strangely detached from the person I remembered being. Founder of Nova Dynamics, Global Innovation Award recipient, Forbes' world's richest entrepreneur, architect of the world's largest robotics and AI platform. The applause lasted nearly a minute. When it finally faded, I walked to the podium. I looked at the audience. Then I stepped away from the microphone. I'd rather tell you about a burned circuit board. The room grew quiet. For the next hour, I spoke very little about success. Instead, I talked about mistakes. About the night Pioneer nearly failed because someone sabotaged it. About professors who protected students instead of their reputations. About teammates who challenged my ideas instead of agreeing with them. About learning that leadership wasn't having every answer. It was creating an environment where other people could discover their own. No slides, no corporate slogans, just stories. When I finished, no one applauded immediately. They were thinking. That meant more to me than applause ever could. During the question session, one student stood. If you could go back. He hesitated. Would you change anything? For just a moment, my two lives overlapped. The collapse of Orion, the hospital room, the impossible second chance. Then I looked around the workshop that had become a global symbol of innovation. I smiled. I already did. The audience laughed, assuming it was a joke. Only I understood how true it was. After the event ended, I wandered back into the original workshop alone. Someone had left a notebook open on one of the benches. Inside were rough sketches for a new rescue robot. The drawings weren't perfect. Neither had mine been. I wrote one sentence in the margin before closing the notebook. Keep building. Your first idea isn't your destination. No signature. It didn't need one. Outside, reporters waited with cameras. One of them asked the same question I'd heard countless times over the years. Mr. Lin, you've become the wealthiest technology entrepreneur in the world. You're at the top of the Forbes list. What achievement are you most proud of? I looked back through the workshop window. Young students were already arguing over design improvements. Nobody had noticed I was watching. I answered without turning around. Not the ranking, not the company, the fact that they don't need me anymore. The reporter looked surprised. I continued. A company that depends on one person has already begun to fail. My greatest success is that Nova Dynamics will continue building the future long after I'm gone. That evening, I visited Professor Liang at his home. Retirement suited him. His garden was filled with carefully maintained bonsai trees. He poured tea as though we were discussing another ordinary workshop meeting. I saw the interview. You always find them. He smiled. I like your answer. It was yours first. He shook his head. No, you finally made it your own. We sat in comfortable silence, the kind earned over decades. Before I left, he handed me a small wooden box. Inside was the first workshop key, the one he'd carried for years. I don't need it anymore. I closed the lid gently. I'll keep it safe. I know. Months later, Forbes released its annual global rankings. Nova Dynamics had become the world's most valuable innovation company. My name stood at the top of the list. Financial channels celebrated the milestone. Business magazines called it the greatest entrepreneurial story of the century. The headlines were impressive, but they all missed the point. The real story had never been about becoming the richest man in the world. It had begun with an old workshop, a second chance, and one quiet decision. This time, I would build people before I built an empire. Everything else had simply grown from that choice. As sunset painted the Innovation Center in shades of gold, I unlocked the old workshop one last time before heading home. The room was empty, yet it never felt lonely. Every scratch on the workbenches, every repaired machine, every impossible dream that had once seemed too ambitious. They were all still here. I switched off the lights, closed the door, and smiled. Some endings aren't endings at all. They're foundations that quietly continue supporting futures you'll never personally see. That was enough. More than enough. The second chance was never about changing the world first. It was about changing the kind of person who would build it.